Welcome to Asian Insider, podcast series by the Straits Times. I'm your host, Nirmal Ghosh, and today I am joined by Ted Osius, President and CEO of the US ASEAN Business Council in Washington, D.C. Among many other things in his very long bio, which includes 30 years as a diplomat, is the fact that he served as US Ambassador to Vietnam from 2014 to 2017. And the US ASEAN Business Council represents 180, I believe, of the largest American businesses in Southeast Asia. Ambassador, thank you for joining Asian Insider. Good to see you again.
Nirmal, thank you very much. Very happy to see you again.
Right. So everyone is bracing, obviously, for the Donald Trump 2.0 administration in D.C. And one of the major policy agendas is tariffs. President-elect Trump sees tariffs as a potent weapon, it's his favorite word, and key to rejuvenating manufacturing in America. What are the concerns for ASEAN-US trade relations, and which countries in ASEAN should be more or less concerned about what is coming down the pipe? What is your assessment of that?
Well, there are a lot of concerns. There's been a tremendous growth in trade between the United States and ASEAN. In fact, 4 of our top 20 trade partners are in ASEAN: Vietnam, Singapore, Thailand, and Malaysia. And the opportunities are huge. So no one really wants to upset the apple cart too much. Exports from ASEAN have been going up. And of course, the President-elect Trump is quite focused on trade deficits. So one worry is that there could be a retaliation against those countries that have a big trade surplus with the United States. Vietnam, Malaysia, and Thailand come to mind. Another worry is that there will be dramatically increased tariffs. Tariffs on China, he's talked about maybe 60%. Tariffs on other countries, 10% or 20%. That would be very challenging for U.S. companies. They're already in some ways disadvantaged by the fact that they're not in some of the regional trading arrangements. But if import tariffs raise their input costs, that's going to be challenging to U.S. companies. It's also, we're also facing a situation where there's not a huge amount of, hasn't been a very forward-looking trade agenda from the United States for some time. And that's of concern to our friends in ASEAN.
So do you expect, by the way, there's a lot of talk about currencies, the US dollar and so forth. Do you expect any particular currency movements, and are there concerns with regard to ASEAN currencies and the US dollar?
Well, there were currencies in Singapore and Malaysia went pretty high just before the election. And then since the election, there have been some currencies in ASEAN that have fallen a little bit. But this may be reflecting the risks that countries are considering with regard to tariffs. But I don't see major changes in terms of ASEAN currencies versus the dollar in the short term.
Okay.
I think the larger economies in ASEAN, the big 6 countries I think of, they have strong banking systems. They have innovative fintech ecosystems. They have maturing capital markets. And this gives companies a fair amount of flexibility in how they can financially structure their deals. So this is actually not my biggest worry.
Okay. So on that note, what does the US ASEAN Business Council want to see from the new administration in D.C.? What would be your wish list, so to speak?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I mentioned that we haven't had a forward-looking trade agenda for some time. Our companies would love to see, some kind of return to normal view of trade, and that doesn't look like that's going to happen in the short term. There has been an inward turn by the United States, and very often trade issues are framed in terms of national security and how they impact national security. And I expect that's actually going to be even more the case in the next few years. The the ASEAN countries are therefore sometimes wondering how reliable is the United States as an economic partner. There was a recent poll of Southeast Asian opinion leaders by the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies, in which everyone was asked, who's the most influential economic power in Southeast Asia? And 59% said China, 14% said the United States. That does trouble me. And then the fact that the ASEAN nations are kind of moving ahead. They're not waiting for us. There's a lot of movement on trade. Philippines, Korea, a free trade agreement went into force this year. The EU is negotiating an FTA with Thailand and the Philippines. Canada is negotiating an FTA with ASEAN. Indonesia has applied to join the CPTPP, which we're no longer part of. And there are negotiations to upgrade the US-China FTA. So the region keeps moving forward, and the United States isn't putting forth a positive trade agenda. That worries me. We've made some recommendations to whomever the incoming administration. We prepared the recommendations before we knew who won. And we think it's really important to have a forward-looking trade agenda to hold out the possibility of real trade agreements with market access provisions. We think it's possible to deepen supply chains, particularly in critical minerals. And we'd love to see the United States build on the digital economy framework agreement that ASEAN is putting together. These are going to be the rules of the road for the digital economy, which is growing very fast in Southeast Asia. And if we could build on what ASEAN is already doing in this area, that'd be good for our companies, and I think it would be good for the region and the world.
Right. Aside from what we've already talked about, tariffs and currencies, the currencies you said you weren't that concerned, but the tariffs are going to be an issue going forward, certainly. What are the other risk factors are there, if any, of concern to your corporate members?
Well, there certainly are things that people are worried about. I mean, there are these big opportunities in ASEAN. It's growing so fast, big consumer market. It's a location for innovation. And it enables our companies that are heavily invested in ASEAN to compete in Asian markets. And I would just illustrate that with one figure from 2022 to 2023, FDI declined in all regions of Asia except ASEAN. Investment continued to flow into ASEAN, and total exports from ASEAN countries will grow as much as 100% by 2030. That's much more. That's 3 times as much as the growth that's expected in global trade in general. But the risk factors that you're asking about, those are real. What about changing tax policies? What about digital rules, regulations, and standards that are not based on global best practices? What about varying degrees of protectionist policies, like local content requirements? That's been a big issue, particularly in one ASEAN country. Environmental reporting compliance costs, reputational risks. These are all legitimate concerns, and they're probably concerns in other parts of the world as well. And then there's a very interesting aspect of trade with ASEAN that has been kind of accelerating in recent years, since there have been tensions between the United States and China in the field of trade. And that's that a lot of companies have decided to adopt a China plus 1 or a China plus 2 or a China plus 3 strategy. And that's not always simple. There are big opportunities. You look at, for example, Vietnam, Indonesia, Philippines, all growing fast. And a lot of our companies are interested in those 3 countries and the other big economies of Southeast Asia, Thailand, Malaysia, Singapore. But you can't really replicate the ecosystems that companies had in China. It takes time to make sure that you have the engineers and the inputs. And so there are some companies like Intel. This is quite a number of years ago, but when I was in Vietnam as ambassador, Intel was making a major investment, and then found, well, we actually didn't have enough engineers. They didn't have enough input, so they had to build that ecosystem, and successfully did so. And then on the kind of the reverse side, when some of those chip making operations moved to the United States, TSMC, for example, built a facility in Arizona. They found they didn't have the ecosystem, and it caused some real delays in the system. So this is another risk. You need to really do due diligence and sometimes replicate the ecosystem that existed in China.
Could you sort of name any particular ASEAN countries which you think should be doing more, or already are nimble enough, but to be possibly doing more to take advantage of these opportunities, supply chain, divestment and so forth?
Yeah, I mean, actually, ASEAN countries have been doing quite a bit. The Vietnamese have shown how eager they are to attract FDI, and it's been working. They've been kind of leading the pack on foreign direct investment, but Indonesia has been doing quite well. President Prabowo was just in the United States meeting with businesses. General Secretary Tolam was in the United States earlier meeting with businesses. There's been a lot of work to kind of show the doors are open. We want to attract FDI, and we'll do what it takes to bring in that FDI. Addressing bottlenecks, we're addressing challenges. Philippines, which is growing quite fast, they've been working very hard to address particularly bottlenecks in infrastructure. And they've said, look, we've had some of these problems for a long time, but we're really going after them. We're spending the money, we're making the efforts to go after these bottlenecks. And they've done very effective road shows to really advertise the benefits of investing in the Philippines. So there's much to be done.
Mm-hmm.
And there's kind of I think a virtual cycle underway right now where every ASEAN country realizes you got to compete against your neighbors for that foreign direct investment. And it's not just going to flow naturally because you're so great. I mean, you really got to have incentives, and you've got to get out there and explain why it's really a good idea to invest in Indonesia or the Philippines or Thailand or Vietnam or Malaysia. So lots of work can be done, and I think a lot of work is being done.
So amid this, stay with that for a while. Amid this changing trade and economic environment, rapidly changing actually in the next couple of months, what specific opportunities present themselves for US investors and for ASEAN investors for that matter?
Well, for one thing, growth is very high. When I look at the globe, I think that the next 10 years, we're going to be seeing a lot of growth in India and in Southeast Asia. And within Southeast Asia, there's a range. High growth is expected for at least 10 years in Vietnam, Indonesia, Philippines. Strong growth in other ASEAN countries as well. So, you look first at the growth opportunities, and then you start to look at the fact these are very innovative. And there's a lot of innovation going on. There are opportunities to expand, for example, semiconductor production, digital commerce, medical devices, all in ASEAN. ASEAN is increasingly a leader in setting the rules of the road for trade. I mean, that was not the case before. ASEAN sort of received the rules and dealt with them, but that's not happening anymore. For the last 8, 9, 10 years, ASEAN has been working very hard to streamline its regional trade efficiency and competitiveness. It's been eliminating non-tariff barriers, created the ASEAN single window. And then I mentioned the DEFA. Singapore really has been leading. It has 4 digital economy agreements and a digital economic partnership agreement, and it's actually Singaporeans who are in some ways driving the train on this new digital economy framework agreement for all of ASEAN. And then the largest free trade area in the world right now is RCEP. We're not part of it, but ASEAN is part of it. And I think that intra-regional trade in Asia is going up very fast, expected to rise by 65%, 400 billion a year by 2030. This is a good sign for US and ASEAN investors. And when I look at what our companies are doing, the companies that I work with, they're very bullish on digital, on energy and the energy transition, on health and life sciences, on transportation, on financial services. There's a great deal of bullishness. And you see opportunities as a result of AI. The AI growth in AI in a region that's receptive to it and sees opportunities could add as much as $1 trillion to the region's GDP by 2030. And we're already seeing investments flow into the region. AWS recently announced almost $9 billion investment over the next 5 years. Microsoft has announced big investments in Indonesia and Malaysia. Google has announced investments. AI skilling opportunities are being provided by Microsoft. Oracle is working to train Singaporeans. I mean, there's a whole lot of investments being made in this area, as well as, I think, in the digital economy writ large.
That's encouraging. I mean, it sounds like regardless of what happens in DC and regardless of the new, sort of tariffs and whatnot, some of these underlying trends will continue because there's general optimism on ASEAN-US ties and in, the mutual investment, right?
I think so. That's been my impression, that even though we don't have all the, we don't have exactly the trade policies that I'd love to see us have, companies are acting anyway. I tried to explain to the Vietnamese who were troubled by the fact that their economy is designated a non-market economy. It is not really making that much difference. Investors aren't saying, well, what is the Department of Commerce thinking? No, they're seeing these underlying trends and they're going for it. And they're investing heavily in Vietnam. They're not waiting for governments to act. A good friend of mine says, when governments can't act, then business must. And I think that's what's happening. Governments aren't necessarily doing the right things, but business is engaged anyway and going ahead anyway.
That's very interesting. Thank you for that. That's really encouraging, in fact. Thank you, Ambassador Ted Osius. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you very much, Nirmal. I really appreciate that you talking with me.
So that nicely wraps this discussion up for the Asian Insider podcast. I'm your host, Nirmal Ghosh. And this episode was produced and edited by Faiza Sani. Join me and my expert guests for more episodes on the 3rd and 4th Friday of every month.